Thank you for joining us into this afternoon's webinar, which is going to be an in-the-weeds discussion of the new reserve requirements that have recently been enacted by the legislature. We're not going to really go into the history of this. We're really going to get into the actual meat and potatoes of the SEERs and what it means for you as board members. This is going to be geared, just a note, to condominium associations. However, we invite anybody who's here from our HOA board to please join us and stay with us, because there's certain aspects that will affect HOAs probably down the road. Just a couple of housekeeping. We ask that if you would like to submit a question, you do so in the Q&A. We will be going through the program. A lot of the questions that you have may be answered during the dialogue between Will and myself, and then we will have ample time at the end for questions. A note on the information given out today is that this is going to be a general information webinar about the reserve study requirements, okay? It is not meant to answer any specific questions to your association, either having to deal with your association's requirements, docs, whatever. We counsel that should you have any questions as regards the SEERs or any sort of reserve study to your particular association, that you contact your reserve specialist, engineer, and/or legal counsel to answer of any of those specific questions. Okay, so I just want to make sure that everybody understands that we're going to be giving general information because we're unaware of your particular situation or your particular things that you need to know for your association. So without further ado, my name is Doug Weinstein. I'm Senior Vice President of Operations for AKAM Southeast. We are one of the area's leading property management, full service real estate management firms in South Florida. Joining me, and I'm sure a lot of you know him, is Will Simmons. Will is president of one of the leading reserve study specialists, Association Reserves, that has practiced in the South Florida area for years and has been one of the leading forces in the legislation and things happening with the SEERS study. So Will, welcome aboard.
Thank you, sir. Glad to be here and looking forward to it.
And what I'd like to do at first, if we could just right away go really into what is a SEERS. You know, everybody's heard rumors, what's in the SEERS, was things put out of the SEERS, was it extended, wasn't it extended? So I think let's start off, if you could give us a basic review of you as an association's reserve specialist. What are you going to look for? What are the time frames? And then we'll get more into the weeds of the particulars.
Yeah, sure. Well, what I've been trying to emphasize to everybody looking at these new requirements for the SEERS, the Structural Integrity Reserve Study, is to focus first on the last two letters there. This is still a reserve study, okay? So it's a new creation of the legislature, but it's just basically taking the concept of a reserve study and making it more specific and more I guess, restricted with regard to the financial recommendations when it comes to certain components of a building, okay? So we see up there on the screen, you've got the things that are now listed as, you know, quote unquote, structural components in Senate Bill 154. A lot of the things that you typically would have always seen in a reserve study. So, you know, we've got here, actually, this list looks like it's from the original bill, SB 4D. There's a couple of minor modifications that came to that, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later on during the cleanup bill. But this was the first version of the list. So you see there, you've got roof, load-bearing walls, primary structural members, floor, foundation, fireproofing, plumbing, electrical. Everybody can read those for themselves. What I want to emphasize is that some of these things have always been reserve requirements in Florida, right? So for condos and co-ops, they've always been asked to reserve for roofing, painting, and pavement resurfacing, and then anything else over $10,000. So you kind of see where this list originated from. It was built off of those three things. Pavement is the only one here that's excluded because in theory, the pavement of a building has absolutely nothing to do with the structure. I think you can actually make a similar argument for plumbing and electrical, but maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. The point is, the state is now kind of drawing a line around particular components and saying, these are critical, these have to be funded for. And ultimately, the takeaway is that associations can no longer waive reserves or partially fund reserves for these specific things on the list. But at the end of the day, you know, again, it's still a reserve study. It still requires a physical analysis and inspection of the building, and then a financial analysis where somebody like us puts together a financial plan and a recommendation for the client to follow so that they don't get caught by surprise and that they have adequate funds without the need for loans and special assessments. So, you know, a reserve study has been around for decades, and this is just kind of a new take on that concept.
Right. And now with this concept, and I've been talking to a lot of boards, is that you really have to now kind of take a look at it, and we'll go into that in a minute, is the fact that you're really now going to have two different reserve studies in effect.
Mhm.
You know, one will be the Sears required components ones, and we'll get into how we treat that as opposed to the rest of your reserves, but there still are other reserve line items that we're going to see, but that are not subject to the Sears requirements.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that's really important for board members and managers to understand, is that this is not the complete financial picture for a building, right? There's some pretty obvious glaring things that are not on this list: elevators, HVAC systems, interior common areas, swimming pools, tennis courts. You know, there's a lot of high dollar value, high replacement cost items that are not considered here, that still need to be part of your financial plan. And so when we're doing a Sears engagement for a property these days, like you said, Doug, it is ending up being two reports. One is specifically limited to the things listed in the legislation, but we offer a separate, sometimes much larger report, which is for all of the other things that still meet the industry standard criteria for what a reserve component should be.
Right. Because I just want to mention that, because I think what is happening out there, at least what we see, is that everybody is so focused on the Sears,
Yeah.
you know, and the components of the Sears, that they're kind of shoving the rest of their building to the side for a moment, not
Mhm.
realizing that they're, as you just very well said, elevators, you know, generators, things that are an important running to a building that have to be reserved for.
Right.
So, you know, I just want to make sure that everybody just doesn't concentrate on these Sears to the extent of excluding the other requirements that are under the statute.
Right. Yeah, you would be doing a disservice if you only focused on these and completely ignored the other stuff. And by the way, you can't. The
Right.
statute 718 and 719 for co-ops still specify that these types of properties must reserve for roofing, painting, pavement, and anything over $10,000. So that that language in the statute that was, you know, existing all along is still there. The only thing that is different now is this specific requirement for a structural integrity reserve study, but the budgeting requirement for those other things is still in existence. And in fact, the ability to waive or partially fund reserves for those other, what I would call traditional reserve components, has now become more difficult. It now requires a 51% vote of all the voting interests rather than just a majority of a quorum, which is what it was in the past. So yeah, you can't ignore that other stuff.
Right. I think you just said one of the things, and we'll cover that a little more in detail as we get further into the webinar. So
Sure.
let's now go to the next point, is where we clean up the cleanup bill. Basically, you know, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, there were some changes to the original Sears. So let's discuss that now.
Yeah. Yeah, so everyone's clear. The two bills that we've had were Senate Bill 4D, which was signed into law in 2022, and then the cleanup bill, as everyone's called it, was Senate Bill 154, got signed into law last year. And yeah, I think it was a very good effort by the legislature to make this a better, more practical piece of law. As we say there on that second point, where we removed and adjusted some of the components. Going back to that original list, we had the word floor and foundation. Those were widely criticized as things that kind of arbitrary, and how could you really tell a building to ever fund to replace its foundation, right? Imagine a 50-story building in downtown Miami. That's impossible to replace the foundation, right? You'd have to demolish the whole building at that point. So that's not something they should have ever had to reserve for. What we have in their place now is this general sort of catch-all definition that just says the structure, which in theory could include these things, but it's not calling them out specifically any longer, which is an improvement. A lot of people also pointed out that in the original list, it said windows, and I would add windows and doors really should be thought of together. But 99% of the condos out there that we work with, the declaration specifies that the unit owner, not the association, is responsible for the windows and doors. So there's a bit of a pre-qualification now in the bill that says it's really only things that are the association's responsibility.
Right.
If not, even if they're on the list, it doesn't matter. Some other things that just, I think they responded to the overwhelming, cries of people saying there's not enough engineers and architects to do these studies. In the original bill, it said that the visual inspection could only be done by a licensed architect or engineer, and really kind of completely left out all of the credentialed reserve specialists and professional reserve analysts like myself, who have been doing this for a long time and have done thousands of them. So that was a nice improvement. They said, yeah, the visual inspection could be by architect, engineer, or an RS or a PRA. So that really has done a lot to help balance out the supply and demand. That's still a problem, but that was a good thing. And then the second to last one there kind of goes hand in hand with the last point, allowing for two conditions under which the provider of the study may choose not to recommend funding for something. And so the two things that we can now lean on is if the remaining useful life of any of those components is greater than 25 years, or if the remaining life or the cost is not readily determinable, then you don't have to fund reserves for those either. And it makes sense. I mean, it's kind of silly and impractical for me to go to a 5-year-old building somewhere in Florida and tell them, hey, you've got to begin reserving for your electrical components, which could last for 50, 75 years. That would be kind of unnecessary at that point. So it just made this bill a lot more practical and easier to implement.
And one of the things that we are getting a good number of questions on from our clients, and I know other condominium associations too, and to delve into the weeds here on those components. And you brought up one that is one of those. We're getting a lot of questions, and boards are going to their reserve specialists and questioning because they see these SEERs coming back and they see plumbing and electrical on it, and they see low numbers on what the reserve specialist is recommending for reserving for those. And I just wanted to see if you could give a little from your background and your knowledge base and what you're doing as to what exactly are you as reserve specialists? How are you treating those two categories, i.e. plumbing and electrical, as part of the SEERS components?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And for as long as reserve studies have been around, the nature of plumbing and electrical has always kind of been a gray area. First of all, these are very broad terms, okay? What does plumbing mean? Does that mean every length of pipe, every valve, every sink and faucet in a building? Technically, in some sense, that's all plumbing. But what are we really talking about? Does the plumbing component in a SEERS require that we're budgeting to replace all of the common area piping throughout the property? I would say no, and I don't think that's practical for most buildings. I've been doing this for 16 years. I've done thousands of reserve studies. It's a very small percentage of buildings that I've ever worked with that have had to completely repipe the building, right? It does happen. It's not a complete, once in a blue moon thing. It does happen. But more often than not, what you see as buildings age is that they just start to spend more money on repairs, okay? So, it might be, let's say you have 8 plumbing stacks, 8 vertical stacks within a building. If you would do a camera inspection of all 8 of those stacks, you might find a wide variety of conditions. It is not uniform throughout the building. And so you might have a certain amount of repairs that you need to do. You might have a blockage or a pinhole leak somewhere that needs to be addressed. But it's usually not chronic and consistent failure throughout the building. What we do in this case is typically recommend allowances for those types of repairs. So rather than one big, huge, colossal number for completely repiping the building when it turns 50 years old, what we will do is say, let's recommend a decent amount of allowance money every 5 years, right? And maybe that's $50,000 or $100,000 every 5 years to tackle those problems as they come along. And if you do those types of repairs consistently and often throughout the building's history, hopefully you remove the need to do that major project. Now, electrical is, I would say, even more obscure in terms of how to deal with that in a reserve study. Wiring and conduit throughout the building, to me, unless it's aluminum wiring, which might have a fire risk, should last the life of the property. Now, that may mean you need to replace panels, circuit breakers, parts and pieces of the electrical components. Certainly, if you've got old panels that were manufactured by a company that's gone out of business and is known to be a fire risk, yeah, you need to replace those, but that doesn't mean you're rewiring the whole building. So what we do with our clients is we try to get as much understanding of project history as we can. What have you done over the years? Is there a trend we see developing? Are you spending X amount of money on plumbing every so often? Let's model that pattern into the future and have some money going into the reserves to offset that. But it's, I think beyond the scope of a reserve study, especially just based on a visual inspection. Keep in mind, you can't see the pipes and the wiring. So it would be pretty arbitrary for somebody to come in and just blindly state, you've got to completely redo these systems at this year at this price. You're muted there, Doug.
You did a phenomenal segue into my next question, which is really going to take us forward in this webinar. Is a board comes to you, Will, and says, we want you to do our Sears reserve study. We want you to do our regular reserve study. If you could just go through very briefly your process, okay? And then we're going to get into the weeds on the funding, the types of funding, how you categorize things. But I just want to get an idea for those boards that have not yet gone to the mattresses, so to speak, and getting this lined up. What is your procedure? How do you look at a building? What questions are you going to ask? What should the management team of that building and the leadership team have ready for you when you walk in the door?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the first thing that we do once we've taken on a new client is we send them some information forms to fill out. And the forms are fairly self-explanatory, and I'm sure other companies have a similar process. But what we're looking for there, first of all, we need a copy of the governing documents for the building. That way we can verify who is responsible for things like windows and doors in case we need to look that up. We also ask for financial information. Typically, that's a copy of the budget, most recent balance sheet. Ultimately, we need to get a projection of how much money will be in reserves at the starting point of the analysis. We ask for project history, which can be hopefully a pretty thorough background about the big ticket items. How old is your roof? Have you modernized your elevators? Have you done X, Y, and Z? And if so, when did that happen? What did you spend? It's kind of an investigative process trying to figure out how we got to this point. What's been the history of this property? Then we come out and do our inspection, and on the inspection date, that's where somebody's going to be doing that visual walkthrough, taking measurements, taking photos, getting model and serial numbers off of equipment, meeting with maintenance staff, meeting with the manager, with the board, and just gathering up all the raw data that we need to inform those life expectancies and costs. So that first part of it is called the physical analysis. That's what we're going for, is getting all the data about the building that we need. Then we get into the financial analysis, where we start to plot out future expenses based on our estimates for remaining life expectancy and cost. We do a timeline of future expenses, and we look at how much money they have in the bank now and run a cash flow model to determine will that be enough or not, and recommend a funding plan so that they will be able to sustain themselves without the need for those special assessments. So what I always tell board members and managers is keep good records. Have that in a safe place, whether it's in the office, ideally online, and something like Dropbox, where you can just direct your reserve study provider to say, here's everything. Here's all the proposals, all the quotes, all the invoices for all the work we've done for however many years you can. That's a treasure trove of information to somebody like me. So,
Right. And I think that's the big question that we get as agents is, oh, is our reserve guy just using a chart somewhere that says, a generator has X number of years useful life, and he's just going in and looking and just putting down numbers? And our answer is no, a good reserve specialist is going to delve into the components more
yeah,
than just putting in a chart from some, professional organization,
right,
because you're incumbent to get the most up-to-date information and supply the best estimate for those reserves going forward. And
right,
I just want to make sure that everybody understands that it is not just something that's pulled out of the sky. It is
right.
something where your building's components are studied.
That's right. Yeah, a good reserve study should be tailored to the actual experience of that building as much as possible. And no two buildings are alike. Even within the same city, you can have a super high-end luxury building that maybe needs somewhat shorter life expectancies and higher replacement costs for things than more of a, let's say economy class building across town. We don't paint them all with the same brush. I mean, there are certain things that are more consistent from one building to the next, but we are basing that off of our experience with this location, this property type, this building material. I'm not going to use a standard for air conditioning systems for the US as a whole, right? We're going to tailor that to South Florida, whereas salty air and they're being used 350 days a year, that kind of thing.
Right. Good. I think that we need boards to basically understand that. And as you said, that's why good record keeping is an invaluable asset to you as a reserve specialist. So the boards out there and managers, please make sure that these records are readily available to your reserve specialist. Otherwise, you're not going to get a really good, clean, fully researched report. So let's move on now to the reports done. Okay, you've done your intake, you've done everything. And the two words that have struck tremors into board
Mhm.
members is fully funded.
Yep.
Okay, I think that is the two words that have really gotten out there and what people are really focused on. So let's discuss that. Let's say, in the new Sears studies, because now, as you said before, the requirements have changed where, totally obfuscating reserves is no longer an option.
Mhm.
Okay. So you now have to either fund as per statute and as per law, or you have to get membership, and we'll get into that in a little bit, membership approval to fund less in certain requirements. But let's start with fully funding, and let's give an idea of what does that really mean?
Yeah. I totally echo your sentiment about this being something that A, scares people, B, confuses them, and C, is very often misunderstood. So let's clear it up. To be fully funding reserves, okay, and I'm careful with the terminology here. Fully funding means it's an ongoing cash contribution to your reserve account that will make sure that you have enough money to replace things when they fail. Okay. You do not need, in this new world with this new legislation, to make up for lost time, right? And that's the one thing that I think a lot of people are panicking about, is they're thinking, if we have waived reserves for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, is the state now telling us that all that money we chose not to collect before, that we now have to do all at once? No, you don't. And fully funding also does not mean raising, as the first point there says, does not mean raising the entire replacement cost for something. Okay, so let me give a little detour into a simple example. let's say you've got a component that lasts for 10 years and costs $10,000 to replace. To be fully funding for that component means that at whatever point in its lifespan it is, you have a target that by the end of its useful life, you will have accumulated the full cost to replace it. It doesn't really matter where you're starting from. So in a perfect world, right, let's say it's a brand new building, it's got the full 10 years of life ahead of it, and you have no money in the bank because it's brand new. That's fine. Okay. Am I going to ignore inflation for the moment and just say you would put aside $1,000 a year for 10 years? And by the end of 10 years, you have all the money you need to replace it. You do that and you start the cycle over. That would be fully funding, that act of putting aside that $1,000 a year. Now, let's say 5 years have gone by and you haven't collected anything. Okay. At the end of that thing's life, which is now another 5 years down the road, you have to have $10,000 in the bank. So because you're starting from zero in this example and it's halfway through its life, that just means you need to make up, effectively double each year. So it's $2,000 a year for those remaining 5 years. It's not 5,000 in the first year to make up for the prior ones that you ignored, and then $1,000 a year after that. All you're doing is just shrinking the amount of time you have to accumulate the total. So
Right.
you do not need to make up for all that lost time, I guess is the simplest way to state it. Now, when you're doing, whether it's pooled reserves or straight line reserves, that can have a slightly different requirement in terms of how you fund it. But at the bottom, the bottom line is that that's all you need to do. When you have pooled reserves, you need to show that the entire pool of funds you have on hand at any point in time never goes to zero. So as cash goes in each year and as cash goes out for paying for all these different expenses, as long as the cash inflows are greater than the cash outflows and you never drain that pool down to zero, you're fine. That's all the state cares about. That's something that we call baseline funding. So yeah, just to, I guess, to draw a further distinction between the word fully funding as opposed to fully funded, it has to do with a path versus a position. So fully funding is the ongoing path to get to that position of being fully funded. In my example before, where I said, if you stop the clock 5 years in and you asked, how much should we have to be fully funded? You would look at the fraction of life that has expired and multiply that by the replacement cost. So if it's 5 years old and it will eventually cost you $10,000, you should have $5,000 in the bank. So to be fully funded in year 5 would mean that you have $5,000. But the state is not requiring you to do that. It just means that by the end of its life, you will have the total by then. So yeah, hopefully that was clear enough. I mean, it's a very, very common question, and most of the time people are asking it, they're missing that first part. They're thinking that we have to make up for all these years when we didn't do enough.
Right. I think that'll assuage some of the fears that we hear out there. Is basically, and particularly, I mean, these are buildings that have waived, fully waived reserves over the years that you're finding are now in the most precarious position
Yeah.
because, they are going to have to contribute now where they weren't used to before. And as a matter of fact, we're going to get into this in a moment, is the due dates and when the SEERs have to be fully funded, because that's another thing that's been a very big question out there. So moving along, let's go into some of the other issues with the SEERs reserve. If we could have the next slide. Okay, so these are going to go through some questions. I think we just discussed this a little bit. If you could just maybe illuminate on it. And you
Yep.
can still use pooled reserves with the SEERs with a few of the caveats that you just mentioned. So I think we can go just rehash that a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think you said something very succinct, is you can't let your pooled reserves go to less than you have committed for.
Yeah, basically that's it. Yeah. So it's probably a little bit longer of an explanation than we want to give here. But there are two different methodologies for how to fund reserves. One is kind of the old-fashioned way, which is called straight line reserves. Rather, the new, modern version is pooled reserves, where you have one pool of funds that is collectively available for any of your reserve components. And so when they created this legislation, they did not do away with pooled reserves. That's totally allowable. If you go to the Florida DBPR's website right now, they have an FAQ section. One of the questions there is, can we still use pooled reserves? And the answer is yes. So if anybody's out there saying they're removing that option, or they're saying that you have to use straight line reserves for your Sears components, that is not true. So yeah, the only thing that's different now is that you effectively might have to have two pools of funds. You can have one pooled reserve account for your Sears, your structural components, and a separate pool of funds for everything else. But each one can still be funded in that manner. The only thing that's different, excuse me, and the intention behind this legislation is to not use money that was intended for important structural elements of the building and to spend that on something else, like, let's say, remodeling the lobby. Okay. Now, both of those are reserve components. Just to be clear, remodeling the lobby should be in your reserve schedule, but it's not as critical as a structural restoration and waterproofing cycle, for example. So when we're doing these two sets of studies now, two pools of funds, two parallel but separate funding plans, each using the pooled method.
Great. I think that really illustrates the difference. And as we said before, we're really thinking of this as now two different separate and distinct reserve studies.
Yeah.
Even though they're
Yeah,
tied into each other, but they really are now becoming two distinct documents.
Right. Yeah, that's really the biggest headache that we've run into in the last year or so, is just splitting the component list for one property into these two categories, but then everything else proceeds as normal, right? You have two documents, one is the structural, one's non-structural, two pools of funds, everything else is kind of the same process after that. But yeah, it's good news. I mean, pooled reserves is by far the preferred way to do this. On average, it costs a lot less. Sometimes, well, on average, it's about a third the cost, let's say, of straight line reserves for the same building, same list of components. Pooling the reserves makes for a much more efficient process and
Right.
a lower impact to the membership.
Right. And I think one of the things too that people need to realize about pooled versus straight line is that if you do straight line, that money cannot be used for something else.
Right.
So if you have $250,000 as a straight line to, say, concrete restoration or exterior structural restoration, and something happens, that's another component, but that you only have X number of dollars, you can't sweep this 250 in to pay for that. And
Right.
under straight line, that's why we recommend to all of our clients is to not even consider that, is to do the pooled reserves, obviously.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you my office that I manage in Florida is one of many offices throughout the country for association reserves, and nowhere outside of Florida does anybody use the straight line method. Just
Right.
absolute fact. I mean, we do thousands of reserve studies across the country. It's only in Florida that people are using the straight line method. The rest of the country switched and never looked back a long time ago.
Right.
So yeah, if your building is using straight line, highly recommend going to the pooled method.
Right. And again, this is an association to those board members on the call. If you're, want further clarification on that, speak to your reserve specialist that you were using in your building. But I think they'll come up with pretty much the same advice, that you really do want to look more towards the pooled reserves than the straight line. Going forward, this is something that we also get asked. Okay. They've just done a reserve study. Okay. They did one, let's say, the end of last year. Okay. How can they dovetail that into the new requirements?
Yeah. So the language in the bill says that a reserve study, or in this case, a structural integrity reserve study, must be based on a visual inspection. It does not state anywhere in the law that that visual inspection must be redone if it was done the year before or 18 months before. In fact, the language says that if you have had a visual inspection done for a milestone inspection or a similar local requirement within the prior 5 years, that may satisfy the visual inspection requirement for the SIRS. So what we've been telling our clients, and I've talked to some other reserve study companies about this, is that, look, if you just did a traditional reserve study before this law was enacted in the last year or so, and really not much has changed at the building, it should not require a new inspection. Okay, if everything that was accounted for in the, or excuse me, everything that's needing to be included was accounted for previously, that should be good enough. So there is such a thing as what's called a no site visit update to a reserve study, and that's typically what you can do. Now, if something has changed, right? If you got damaged by a hurricane, if a major waterproofing project was done, if you did a roof replacement, those are circumstances that might have changed the picture. And so in those cases, we, and I think other providers, would insist on doing another inspection. But again, it's not the same as starting completely from scratch. If somebody measured your roof before and they know the square footage, going back to take a look at it again is not going to be as exhaustive or as expensive as doing it from scratch. So yeah, you don't need to start over. If you've had a prior reserve study done, that's a good thing. You should share that with the companies you're interviewing to do your SIRS. And they will give you their options for whether or not they can use that or not. But in most cases, if it's been pretty recent, then you should be fine. I don't think you should need a new visual inspection.
Right. And I think one of the things, just to let people know that, you also mentioned a couple of things as a sidebar to the Sears, which was the actual milestone, and then stating, and very correctly so, that if you'd had a municipal inspection or a municipal report that needed to be done, that can also suffice. But again, we caution all boards to check with their engineers, reserve specialists, and attorneys to the viability of using previously promulgated documents. Okay,
Exactly.
it's not an across the board thing. You
Right.
really have to see whether that past done document complies with the letter of the new regulations. So I just want to make that sure that you each refer to your own experts on that.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on that too in our next slide too, about specifically talking about milestone inspections. So
Right. Great. So yeah, let's talk about the milestone and how it dovetails into, Will, what you guys do. Because I mean,
yeah.
everybody looks at it as, oh, the milestone and the Sears, and we're concentrating on the Sears, but we also can't forget
Mhm.
that the milestone needs to be done as well, and it does dovetail somewhat into the Sears.
Yeah, somewhat, I think is the key word there. So a
Right.
milestone inspection, if folks are not familiar with what that means, is a inspection specifically of the structure of a building. And that's kind of it. There's no financial analysis that goes along with it. It is not comprehensive in the sense that it's looking at the entirety of a property. It has nothing to do with plumbing or electrical or fire protection. Structure, I guess, could be dependent on the interpretation of the person doing it. Does have to be done by a licensed engineer or architect. Typically, they're going to be required once a building turns 30 years old. But a milestone inspection is more limited in scope. Okay, it is not the basis for a proper reserve study. It might be helpful to have one done and then for your reserve study provider to review that and maybe incorporate some of the findings. If you had a really good engineer go out and do a phase 1 inspection and document conditions and come up with their professional opinion about what needs to go on there, I think the reserve study provider should use that. But it does not cover all the requirements. So just because you might have had a milestone does not mean you're not going to have another inspection done for your SIRS, because the SIRS is looking at more parts and pieces of the property, let alone all of the SIRS items, right? All the mechanical systems, the amenities, all those things we talked about earlier, which are still reserve components that need to be addressed one way or another. So,
Right. I
yeah.
think you bring up a good point that the milestone is very limited in its scope.
Yeah.
And it basically just handles one, very few of the required Sears components and even less so of the other components in a building's reserve study. So I think that's
Mhm.
a very good point. Um, One of the things that we also get, and you touched on a little bit briefly, and I'd like to go into the weeds on this a little bit, is the new waiving requirements or the new waiving limitations that are out there for condominium associations as to, and you touched on it briefly, but I'd like to get more into the details on this. So we know that you can't waive the Sears components. Okay. However, as you said before, there are still items in a reserve study that can be waived. However, the requirements for waiving that have somewhat changed. And I think if we could delve into that a little more.
Yeah, exactly. So by default in the state of Florida, again, you have to reserve for roofing, painting, pavement, and anything over $10,000. Traditionally, if you had a majority of a quorum of people, which is again not a total majority of all the people in the building, it's just some percentage of the building constitutes a quorum, and you get a majority of that group, then that would carry a vote. So traditionally, you could do that for any reserve component. You could waive it entirely or partially fund it. The state has now come in and said you can't do that for these structural components. For everything else, right? The elevators, the pools, the interior stuff, you may still elect to waive or partially fund, but it's now a 51% vote of all the voting interests. Okay, so if you had, I'm just going to use easy numbers here. Let's say you have a building with 100 units in it, and a quorum traditionally might have been 35 owners, let's say. A majority of 35 people would be 18 out of 35. And so you could have had a case where 18 out of 100 people can carry a vote that affects everybody. That's no longer the case. In that scenario, now it would be 51 out of 100 would have to vote to not fund for those things.
Right, exactly. And I think people need to realize that. And again, check with your docs, check with your counsel and stuff in terms of one of the things that boards and managers should be looking at when that time comes. And you do want to start to talk about, bringing this up before a membership meeting and possibly talking about waiving some components, that it is done in conjunction with the new regs. And
Absolutely.
that the
Yeah.
documents have to be prepared like that and the explanation given to members as to exactly what the threshold now is for
Right.
that waiving requirements.
And I want to make clear, it's not a good idea. I'm not
Right,
endorsing, I'm not recommending that anybody waive their reserves. I'm just saying it is still an
correct,
option on the table, but it's not a good option, right? All of these
right,
things we're talking about that you see in your reserve schedule will happen at some point. And so if you're not reserving for them, you're just assuming that you will either pass a special assessment or borrow money to do that thing. There is no option typically to choose not to do it. And so if you kick the can down the road, right, every dollar you don't collect this year is a dollar you're going to have to collect and then some
right.
down the road.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a very important point. And this, we get this as managing agents all the time that our boards discuss with us, and we have to take the position that you need to fully fund. I mean, that is the way to finance, fiscally good management. Now,
Right.
however, there may be instances where that is not entirely possible, but in no way should you be looking at this day and age, particularly why these laws were promulgated, why you should be looking to waive funding, as much as you can. You really need to rethink how
Yeah.
you look at reserves and look at reserve contributions.
Right. Yeah. The phrase we've been using a lot in the last year or two is people need to understand the true cost of ownership. So, to really live in a condo and pay the proper amount requires reserve funding, right? There's There's no other way to do it. I mean, other than loans and special assessments, but that's becoming more and more difficult to do. I mean, these days banks are not as willing to lend to buildings that don't have reserves. So you're just shooting yourselves in the foot if you're gonna
Very, very, very good point, Will. And we're on the front lines of that, and we work with our clients to arrange financing for required capital projects and repairs. And one of the things that we are telling our boards is that we're getting the banks out there that, years ago would not be asking for the documentation they are now. And one of them is they want to see your reserves. They want to see your reserve study, but more importantly, they want to see where you are in funding your reserves.
No,
And they're
absolutely.
going to look very, very heavily on that as they are now looking at condition reports as well. And they're also looking at the reserve study, particularly the Sears components, to see how much that association needs to finance going forward.
Yeah.
So all of that now is taking into effect a bank's decision, where before, I don't think we've got maybe one bank out of 50 we're asking for certain documentation. But
Mm.
that is now the rule rather than the exception. I want to get into timing, requirements, that
Yeah.
type of thing. One of the things that a lot of boards were counting on, which did not happen at the last legislative session when they passed, I think it's HB 1021, that there was going to be some relief in terms of the deadline for the Sears,
Mhm.
which currently before the legislation was that you had to do your Sears study prior to December 31, 2024. That is still the case. There
Yes.
has not been an extension. So I want to make sure all of our board members on the webinar, please, there is no lifeline here. This report needs to be completed as of now by December 31 of 24. That now brings into another top question, I think, which falls in immediacy right after the fully funding question is, where does the law stand right now? The original law, when it came out in HB4, in SB4 and then modified, whatever, there had some language in there that said if a board or if an association finalizes and approves their 2025 budget prior to December 31, 24,
Mhm.
then the requirement to include the Sears fully funded components could be pushed back a year to the 2026 budget. That
Yeah.
was something that everybody latched onto. And
Mhm.
is that still the case?
Yeah, to my knowledge, that is still the case. So exactly what it says, I'll paraphrase the legislation. It says for a budget adopted, okay, and the key word there is the adoption date. A budget adopted after December 31st, 2024, that is when an association may no longer elect to waive or partially fund reserves for their structural components. Here we are in 2024, before that date. Most buildings out there are going to pass a budget this fall, which is before December 31st, 2024. And even if they have had a Sears done, the state, to my reading of it, and I have not heard any attorneys argue this point, um, it says that they may, effectively may still partially fund or waive reserves because that budget adoption date is prior to December 31st, 2024. So does that make it a good idea? No. You should be funding your
Right,
reserves all the time as early as possible. Might
right.
as well get used to it now. But technically speaking, I believe there's one more budget, the one that you will pass this year, in which your owners can choose not to fund for these things.
Right.
Um, of course,
I,
this
I,
is, like we said earlier, this is not legal advice. Consult your attorney to make sure,
correct.
but I have
Correct. And
not
I,
heard
and I want to
any
tell you,
restriction.
and you brought up a good point, that when what we're telling when we get asked this question from our associations, we're telling them, well, yes, again, check with your attorney on this, but is it allowable? Yes, again, subject to your attorney's opinion. But also, whether it's allowable and whether it's a good idea are two different things. And as you just said, what we've been counseling our associations on is don't let if this is what you want to do and it's permissible, don't subject your membership to a complete shock in 2026.
Yeah, right,
Know that you're going to have to do this, so phase it in. You
right.
know, where let's say a building had gone with a 50% funding rate, go to 75 in 25. Give, you
Yeah,
know, go to something that doesn't cause an earthquake amongst your membership in January of 26 when
right.
they get this budget that goes, oh, hell, where did that come from?
Yeah, get the message out. I mean, most people, I think, if you live in a condo, are at least somewhat aware that things have changed. But if you're on a board out there, this is your job, is to educate your membership and to prepare them and to inform them about these new requirements and how it's going to affect them. And I think the earlier you do that, the better. In my experience, people hate surprises more than they hate bad news. If it's bad news and a surprise, that's kind of the worst case scenario. But if you tell them now and give people time to absorb that and say, look, within the next 2 years, this is going to be the reality. That gives people a little bit of breathing room to do something about it. But yeah, don't let them wake up first thing in 2026 or wherever it is and be shocked. Yeah, that's not great.
Right. Also, I just want to take this one moment to just touch on the point that, you know, as you get your reports done, there is requirements for getting that report to membership, posting it on the association's website to make sure that it is available to your membership. So again, you have to be cognizant to be part to make sure that you're in compliance with those part of this of the regulations and the statute.
Mhm.
And one of the things that you know you're going to have to do now is we had recently had a webinar on the couple of new bills that came forward, is that in the coming period of time, you know, condominiums with X number of units are now going to have websites where it was only past those with 150 or and above. So
Mhm.
just make sure that you're getting that all attuned to be in compliance with some of those other regs. But all of these documents, whether it be the milestone, whether it be the Sears, all are part of your association records, which
Mhm.
have to be on your website and available to your membership. Um, so we have some chat questions, which I think were very, very pertinent. So let me go to that. And first one we have is, to be clear, unit owners are responsible for windows and doors. And I think we answered that in the sense of this is going to be dictated by what your documents say. Whose responsibility are the windows and doors in your property according to your documents? Okay. Some buildings we've seen that it makes the apartment or the unit windows and doors the responsibility of the unit owner. Some documents we've seen make it part of the association's responsibility. Or there's also something along the things of repair versus replacement. So you want to check with your docs. It's not a blanket thing that we can give you, you know, an advice on now. And that's why, as Will said, one of the preeminent things that you need to have your reserve specialist apprised of are your documents. So they can tell you what needs to be included, and if indeed anything other than quote unquote common area windows and doors need to be included.
Mhm.
Okay. Next question is, so how so how does this look from a budget perspective for 2025? So two line item on the budget. I guess that what that means is, do we have a two line item for a Sears reserve contribution and then another line item for a non-Sears reserve contribution on the budget? What is
Yeah,
your recommendation, Will?
I would say yes. Yeah, I think that's what makes the most sense. And the reason for that is because of what we were talking about a few minutes ago. One of those will soon be mandatory, the other is optional. So if you present it as, you know, this type of reserves and this type of reserves, and the owners are clear about which one they don't have a choice in, I think that's the best way to do it. Yeah, two line items on the budget, I would say. There was one quick question before that about windows there. Somebody was asking, what sense does it make to require associations to reserve for windows if they own them, but doesn't require anything if the owners are responsible. Well, it's a simple one. The owners would have to pay out of pocket for replacing the windows in that case. It's the money for replacing them doesn't come out of the association's bank account. So that's why. I mean, sometimes an association will serve as a project manager of sorts and set a specification and require that all people with older windows and doors have to replace them with impact, but then the cost gets charged back to the unit owners. Ultimately, the cost is not paid out of the association's bank account. So that's why.
Right, great. And then next question is, what Sears duties may be performed by persons who are not engineers, architects, or reserve specialists?
Yeah, well, I guess to be really specific, it says that the Sears must be based on a visual inspection, and that visual inspection must be performed or verified by an engineer, architect, or reserve specialist, or a PRA, a professional reserve analyst. So in theory, I suppose, let's say you had an engineer and a CPA who are working together. The engineer goes out, does that inspection, and they come up with a table full of data for useful life and cost, and they hand that off to a CPA who does the financial analysis portion of it. I suppose that could work, although I think that's highly unlikely. Most of the time it's going to be one company that does both. So yeah, there could be some duties performed by people who don't have those credentials, but it would have to be something other than the visual inspection.
Right. Next question is, if you adopt your 2025 budget before 12/31/24, is the 51% membership threshold still required to waive?
I am not 100% sure on this, to be honest with you. I think that it could be the case that 51% threshold for non-Sears components may already be effective. That one I would check with an attorney about to be sure. Maybe that's a follow-up we can send after the session today. That one, I seem to recall there might be something in the law that says that immediately the inability to waive or partially fund without a 51% vote, that might already be in effect.
Right. And again, I think this is definitely, as you point, very good for any association's legal counsel to opine on that.
Yeah.
Next question is, how much higher are associations seeing their required reserves come in after the Sears study? This particular person writes, we're a 13-unit building that's never had a reserve study and regularly waived more than token reserve funding. Starting with our 2023-24 fiscal year, we've been collecting an amount equivalent to 10% of our operating budget as a reserve. Is preparation for the required Sears funding, I'm wondering how much higher we can expect this to go. Well, that's kind of a loaded question that, again, depending
Yeah.
upon your particular components, but any thought on this, Will?
Yeah, I can try to give some general kind of rules of thumb here. So first of all, it depends on how old the building is, how close to expiration your components are, what they cost, all that kind of thing. We hear this, 10% of the budget as a reserve component. That's a rule of thumb that's come around in the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, let's say, that comes from mortgages backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I believe, that they stipulate that 10% of their budget is the minimum you have to reserve if your building wants to qualify for those types of mortgages. What we have seen, I'll tell you this, that healthy buildings, ones that are doing a good job, that are in a good position with respect to reserves, on average, they contribute between 15 and 40% of the annual budget to reserves. So if you're in a condo, if you're in an older condo, one on the coastline, you're definitely skewing towards the higher end of that range, right? So 10% of the budget is probably not enough. It could be as high as 20 or 30 or more as a percentage of the budget. So again, that one requires a lot more context to properly answer, but I would guess it's probably going to go up, not tenfold, right? But it depends. Sometimes the required reserve amount is a combination of a special assessment and ongoing funding from there.
Okay, great. Next question is more a milestone question, and it's something I'll put out there, but I will give an answer to it in terms of you should check with your local building official. But the question is the 30, 25, 30, 40, 50 recertification the same as a milestone? My building is 27 years old, and the city said we were due for a recertification by December 21st. What you need to look at is there's two components to a structural study of your building.
Mhm.
One is the requirement under the Senate bills that require if you had your C of O before X number of date, you have to have a milestone inspection done by December 31 of 24. And then there may be, if you've had a recent municipal study recertification done, it may you may be able to use that depending upon when it was done and what components were looked at. Again, this is something you should speak with your counsel on, but to do that. But just reminding that local municipalities have some leeway in determining the milestone and when they're due.
Yeah,
So again, this is something that you need to check with your local AHJ, as the case may be, or your attorney.
right.
Next question is, can an association have one reserve study that includes the Sears instead of two separate reserves?
Yeah, well, I would say that it is one engagement, right? So if a building hires our company or somebody else to do a SIRS, it can be one engagement done for one fee that produces two separate documents. If the question is, can you have one document that includes the SIRS and everything else? I wouldn't say that's very practical because your financial analysis is going to include everything under one blanket at that point, which makes it difficult because only some of those components are effectively now mandatory, whereas others are not. So you really, the industry response to this pretty much across the board, as far as I'm aware, is to do two separate documents. You can have them done by the same company at the same time. Maybe it's one inspection of the building, but at the end of the day, because it's driven by two different financial requirements, that's when it makes sense to have two separate reserve schedules and recommendations to go along with them.
Okay. We have a particular question having to deal with a contribution. And the question is, assume a condominium is on a calendar year, uses a pooled method, and will waive their recommended 2025 Sears contribution of, say, and they're using a number of 300,000 prior to 12/31/24. And the question is, must the full 300,000 be contributed to reserves by 1/1/26 in order to be consistent with the Sears cash flow analysis, which has a 1/1/26 Sears cash flow analysis based upon the 300,000 being contributed to reserves in 25. So I think the question comes down to, if you do kick the can down the road to take advantage of that year, what happens to the amount that was scheduled to be contributed in that kick
Yeah,
the can down the road year,
yeah,
so to speak?
sure. It doesn't always mean that you will have to collect 300,000 in addition to what you would have otherwise. That one is a tricky one to answer without knowing the schedule
Right.
of expenses. If there was a bunch of components that are at the end of their lifespan and needed to be done right away or should have been funded for right away, and you just took that year off, but they're still at the end of their life, you still need to deal with those things, plus other ones which may now have shifted into focus. So, you put this in different terms, which might be helpful for people. If you think of funding for a retirement, for example, you have two things going on. You have money and time, right? And so if you start funding retirement when you're 21 years old, right, and you're working in your first job, and you're looking at retiring at 65, you might have the same end goal in mind, but you have a lot more time to get there. Now, if I'm going to somebody who's 52 years old and they want to retire at 65, and they have the same goal, but they haven't been funding for the first 30 years of their career, it's going to be a much more difficult proposition. It might still be the same goal. I just now have a much shorter duration of time in which to collect that money. So if you think of your reserves kind of as being that event on the horizon that you're saving for, every year that you don't recognize that and don't put some money away is just shrinking the time horizon in which you can get prepared for it. Now, ultimately, the worst, most extreme example of that is a special assessment, right? You've run out of time. You need all the money for something. You don't have any. That will be an amount of money you've got to collect right away. And we call that a special assessment, although in most cases, I don't think there's anything really special about it. It's just the inevitable result of not having done anything before. And that's unfortunate, but it could have been prevented. And that's kind of the whole point of this exercise.
Great. I think you made it's a very good analogy, actually, that to think about it, and how associations should look forward to this. One of the things that I would like to, before we close out, one of the things that I would like to just really and ask for, Will, some closing comments from you, and to board members and managers that they're really looking to navigate the waters on this. Just some closing points from your end as the reserve specialist and one of the leading ones in South Florida that would be helpful, please.
Sure. Well, I guess we understand this is a difficult time for condos, right? You're dealing with new legislation that's requiring higher budgets. You're also dealing with insurance increases. We're all dealing with general inflation in the economy, which has driven up the cost of everything, right? You're not alone. The vast majority of buildings that we work with are not doing enough historically with regard to reserves. There are some out there that have been on a really good track, and hopefully this is not as disruptive to them. But this is changing the way people view living in a condo. And I think it might take a couple years for the market to really appreciate all this and understand that this is the new reality. It's been like this in the rest of the country for a long time. Florida is the only place in the US where the membership of an association could have ever waived reserves. So that's not really new to the rest of the country. It is somewhat new to Florida. I think historically you could have made the argument that a building that was funding its reserves and trying to be responsible almost got punished in the marketplace because their dues would have been higher than a building across the street that was not funding reserves and just special assessing for everything. So, to the uneducated buyer, they're looking at two buildings, comparing one against the other. They see the dues here are $500 a month and here they're $300 a month. Well, I'm going with the $300 a month, not realizing there's going to be another shoe that's going to drop at some point. Now that this legislation is affecting everybody all at once, I think that's ultimately a good thing. It will kind of normalize the need for reserves. Buildings that were trying to do the right thing before and getting kind of punished for it won't be anymore. Everybody's hopefully, like I mentioned earlier, coming around to this notion of the true cost of ownership, and making sure that they are saving enough money for what they need to. So yeah, don't delay. If you have not gotten your CSRS done or contacted a company to do it for you, it's crazy to think here we are in April, but time is running out. Our company is booking out inspections several months from now. I've heard from others that a couple other companies are done for the year. They are at capacity. So, we touched on it a little bit earlier about hopefully they would have extended the deadline. That didn't happen. We pushed for that. Others pushed for that to say, look, there are way more buildings than there are providers, and nothing happened. So here we are. The state law is that you have to have this done by the end of the year. And so I would say, don't sit on your hands. This is an important thing to do.
Right. I think that is so much worthwhile advice, and we're advising our boards of the same thing, and that goes not only for the Sears viewers but also for the milestones.
Yep.
You're doing the same crunch, and I'm hearing from engineers that are not even quoting buildings anymore
Yep.
because they just can't absorb the amount of work. So, get on the horn, you get your management company to, get you proposals for these studies, get them done. Now, there is a provision in the laws, and I'm not advocating this, but there is a provision that allows the local municipality that if you have certain agreements in place on reports, that they may let you have an extension in terms of filing them. Particularly, this has more to do with the milestone than the Sears. But again, don't bank on extensions. Really get into the meat of this and get these things booked now, because it's coming very close to where you won't be able to get anybody to do these. And the other thing that I want everybody to go away with is one thing that Will was very delved on, is your record keeping. Okay, when that reserve specialist walks in your door to do your intake, every bit of record keeping that you could show them not only makes their job easier, but makes their job more accurate. And the more accurate they are, the better off the association is going to be, because it will give more of an accurate rather than just guesswork.
Yeah.
And in this day and age of the financial implications, you want to be as fact-driven as you can. So I think that needs to be taken into account when you sign up for these reserves, and make sure you have your records ready. Well, I can tell you what an informative webinar this has been for your expertise. You are one of the leading reserves specialists out there. Your input is always welcome. To those members to those attendees, you will be getting a link to the recorded version of this, so you can share it with your other board members or your membership. Will can be reached at wsimons@reservestudy.com. Again, my name is Doug Weinstein. I can be reached at dweinstein@akam.com. We look forward to some more pertinent webinars, so check your emails. We will be getting these things out. But again, this is one of the most important things facing your association for this year, is both your milestone and the Sears. Hopefully, we were able to answer some general questions. But again, I really want to emphasize, should you have any questions on your particular association, you have a plethora of professionals out there between your management company, your accountant, your reserve specialist, and your engineer, and of course, your attorney. So thank you for joining us. We wish you a good rest of the afternoon, and stay safe. And again, Will, thank you for your invaluable content today.
Doug, thank you. Thanks everybody at AKAM for putting this on. I really appreciate it, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all.